Welcome to part 2 of my Best of Midnight Library series. This is honestly really fun to look back and see with new eyes these stories I spent so much time with. And with the help of Matt Collins, I get to see what else is there. And that's the thing about stories that are special. There are so many layers. You can go back and find new profound messages or new questions that you can't answer but are still fun to think about. Tonight, we'll talk about my 3-part series from Season 3, The Greatest Myth in Baseball History. Of all the episodes I've done, these are some of the most heavily researched, heavily thought out, and revised episodes in my 4 seasons. If anyone wants to get an idea of what I consider classic Midnight Library of Baseball episodes, go to this series. And I love this story of the 1919 Black Sox because you can approach it from so many different characters and so many different themes. And I want to thank all the listeners who voted and chose the episodes we ended up discussing. Thank you. Okay, so here we go. So, the greatest myth in baseball history? Is it?
Yeah. So what is the myth?
What?
Because there are a lot of myths that you expose in all of this.
Well, that's a good question. When I made that title, I was referring to the totality of the myths. And I think I say in this episode, it's like the Russian doll aspect of it. It's like you have the myth of Shoeless Joe. Did he cheat? Did he not? What were the underlying causes that we seem to see as true, but actually aren't? The
Hmm.
relationships between the players, the undercurrent of, what baseball and livelihoods of baseball players were like. So I think it's a series of myths that stack up here, create this overwhelming, it's like one myth after another. And to me, it just blows up. It's all these things that we thought we understood, or maybe we had an idea about, but really aren't true because of the perpetuation of these lies based on 8 men out, for one thing, and a lack of research for another.
One thing that we know is not a myth is that there were a significant number of players on that 1919 roster who did conspire to throw games and did make a deal with unsavory types to affect betting outcomes of the game, and they were rewarded for it. And the part that I remember feeling in the moment when I listened to those episodes the first time and that I felt again when I re-listened to them was a question that again that might tap into an expertise that you also have, Ben, which is what causes a professional athlete, in this case, who has the capability of competing at the most elite level of play in baseball to decide that they will subordinate their skill and their effort in order to deliberately lose and pocket some reward. In other words, to lie, to basically surrender, to lie, to quiet whatever competitive impulses that they have to be the best, to win, in order to profit from all of this.
Yeah.
And that part I could not and still cannot square, as I can't imagine competitive athletes who spend an entire lifetime getting to where they are
Mm.
saying, I'm going to deliberately lose.
Okay. So I need to go back and add some of those parts. I mean, like what I really tried to dig into was it's multifaceted. But actually what's coming to mind now feels like something I touched on, but is actually much bigger than what I included. So, what I did include and talk about was one, they didn't think it was a big deal and nobody was actually regulating betting. And so if nobody's gonna even slap you on the wrist for it, why would you care? But then, of course, there is just inherent honor in not cheating. And the amount that players were paid, there was no pension, there was no insurance. If you get an injury, you're done. So it's really cutthroat in that way, or it was. Even though they were getting paid more than players on other teams, there was that reality to it and feeling like you were not appreciated. And that just grows over time. And that's relative because somebody who's digging coal will see a baseball player and like, oh, that's the life. Like, how could you resent any part of that? But once you're in that world as a player and day after day, that is your life and you can't connect anymore to what it used to be, then that resentment builds. Then you're not being recognized, you're being unappreciated, overlooked. And also, what just came to me now is the lack of understanding feeling between the players and fans. You know, there's that distance that must have grown. And it's funny to say that because at this time, this is one of the most accessible periods. Fans could walk up to players. There was that closeness that you never had. But for players like Shoeless Joe, like Eddie Seacott to do this, there's I don't know if it's an apathy, but there's a lack of awareness of what you're doing that could hurt fans. Because this was seen as a huge betrayal because baseball was enormous. And that's another thing that was hard to do and maybe still, I didn't completely do is relate to people today of how big a deal baseball was then. It's really hard to fathom how big baseball was, how integral it was in everybody's lives, even if you were not a baseball fan. It was everywhere. It was social media. It was the news. It was celebrity, and everybody played baseball. So I think because of, some aspect, whether it was denial or true separation, players um, were not thinking about what this would mean to fans. But that goes back to it was never a big deal before, so they didn't think they'd be caught. They didn't think it would be a big deal, and so the fans wouldn't really know.
I just can't imagine spending a lifetime in sport, however long that lifetime is, with the goal of outscoring, playing better defense, pitching better, running the bases better, having a better strategy than the other guy, the other team, and and all of that accumulating into this muscle memory and an expectation that I am going to win. I want to win, and then quieting that and saying not only am I going to not care as much, but I'm actually going to tip the other way, and I'm going to throw these games. And so all of these things that I spent my professional career developing, now they don't matter. Or maybe they never mattered in the first place. But I hear about athletes like famously Tom Brady and Michael Jordan, who were competitive at everything. They, of course, were competitive in their professional sports, but if they played backgammon, they wanted to kill you. If they were playing poker, they wanted to kill you. If they were playing, golf, which
Yeah.
are both big golfers. They want to win. They want to win in everything that they do. And I'm not necessarily saying that wanting to win and dominate every single part of your life is healthy, but I find it a natural consequence of playing professional sports. And so I still can't understand people who would say, you know what, um, I'm gonna I'm going to get my reward not from being excellent in my craft. I'm going to get my reward from doing what I can to manipulate the outcome on the field in a way that is totally artificial. And by the way, that will, sully the record of myself and my teammates.
Yeah. It's like when as you're talking about that, I'm imagining a close up either in, a novel form or a film where you're in that moment with, let's just say Eddie Seacott, right? Like his muscle memory is all about winning and pitching to strike someone out. And it's almost like a sci-fi horror where you have this other part of you inside that's telling you to do something else and you're grappling with these two parts of yourselves, right? And it's like one's trying to pull the strings and the other part is can't let go of the muscle memory and it must be really difficult. And I would imagine that there were times when they were trying to throw and they couldn't, right? They ended up getting a hit or throwing a strike, and it was that back and forth that would have been fascinating to see on a closer level.
Do you know, Ben, very much detail about something you alluded to but didn't go deeply on in the episode, which was the danger that these athletes might have been in once they made the deal with the devil, so to speak, and had agreed to actually carry this out. Do you have any way of being able to assess the real danger they would have been if they had somehow backed out or had a change of heart?
I didn't put a lot in about that because it was hard to find definitive resource material on that to see whether they were in danger. And I think it was Eddie Seacott who talked about um, the danger, and it's hard to know because nothing did happen to them, right? And um, I mean, there's a lot of speculation, which makes it still an interesting story because you know, supposedly also Chick Gandil, who was one of the ringleaders, um, you know, took off to California with all of the money. So um, if that's the case, it's like, is there a bounty on his head? Did he leave because of that? So I couldn't find a lot. And, there are people who've done tons of research on this. And I definitely could have missed that, but I didn't find a lot that said definitively that they were in danger. And it's hard to trust the players when they were saying that because they were outed at this point. So part of that was like, well, I had to, I couldn't confess or I couldn't give it back. I couldn't tell people because I felt like I was in danger. And so it's a way to kind of play the victim more and try to draw some sympathy instead of outrage in what you did. So it's from what I found, it was hard to tell, and it was hard to tell who was telling the truth and who was lying.
I so wish that I could hop in a time capsule
Yeah,
and ask them those sorts of questions in a safe space. It's very easy for me to imagine through the lens of 2026 how the a criminal element could really terrify these athletes into making a compromising decision.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, and certainly another element of of professional sports that was truer back then than it is certainly today was that the athletes were much more woven into the everyday fabric of life, and so much so that it was not uncommon even for really terrific ball players, even into the mid 20th century, to have jobs during the off season that were quite
yeah,
ordinary.
yeah,
And so they would have been one of the guys for a few months of the year and then would have had their baseball lives some other
yeah,
part of the year. And so uh, they would not have had all of them, or maybe even any of them, the entourages and the security details and the guards up against all of these potential
yeah.
threats. They would have been an easier mark. And I wonder how all of that went down and what kind of maybe fear motivated them to do what they did.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a possibility. And when you're talking about this um, muscle memory and just training, like it's your whole life to win and to try and to compete and help your teammates. And like if they were changing their minds, what would have happened?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Right, right.
And yeah, it is interesting, but you would think, not necessarily true, but you would think that there would be evidence, uh, I don't know, at a deeper level of threats of, some kind of manipulation happening if they were trying to change their minds, and then, the mob or whoever was involved in that was strong arming them to go through with it. But yeah, that is really interesting.
How do you think about, in retrospect, Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was brought in to clean up the game and seemed to have made an example out of the 1919 White Sox.
What do I think about him and his choice?
Well, what do you think about his legacy?
That's another series, right? The
He's a complicated figure, I know.
yeah, yeah. I it's one of the things that we tend to do is uh imprint our own modern day morals and perspectives on people of the past. And so it's easy to say, well, I mean, especially with segregation, but I don't want to go off topic here. But with Kennesaw Mountain Lands, with what he did, I did an episode on Patreon, a short episode, um, speculative history, revisionist history on what would have happened if he would have had a longer uh, vision, if Kennesaw Mountain Landis would have a longer vision and would have said, okay, we're going to ban these guys for 1 or 2 years and then they'll be able to come back. But in that time, they're going to be honest. They're going to talk with the community. They're going to apologize. They're going to have honest conversations about what they did and why. And it's like I feel like he really missed an opportunity. And this is my modern day perspective, I know, but I still think that would have been amazing for Shoeless Joe to come back after 2 years, right? How glorious that would be for fans. I mean, you're talking about Rick Ankiel in the headlines and people coming to that game for his comeback and the support that he got. What would that have looked like for Shoeless Joe, right? To come back, a stadium full of people just waiting to see what he can do, how he's going to prove himself again after doing this horrible thing. And what also Kennesaw Mountain Landis would have looked like a saint, right? To give this guy another chance, to be forgiving. So like it's understandable why Landis was so harsh, what he was trying to do, what he stepped into, what the climate was at that time. Um, but I think this feels true for most things. It's political too. It's like in the moment, it feels like, oh, you have to really strike this person down. They have to be a lesson. But then, a little while later, people forget, people forgive. And so, punishment for the sake of punishment doesn't make sense if it's not leading to change. And there are all these opportunities for change that didn't happen because there was just this absolute punishment. These guys are gone and there's nothing they can do. And they can tell their story from this place, but it comes from a place of shame now instead of, okay, I was given another chance. I know what I did wrong, and now I want to help other people understand.
There was a precedent set in that decision that Landis made about a recognition that there are degrees of violation of the game, and that surpassing certain levels of wrongdoing would get you the most extreme punishment. And so, in your world of maybe a 1 or 2 year break, and then you can petition to come back and play, if that had happened instead of the lifetime ban, might we have seen Pete Rose become eligible for the Baseball Hall of Fame after, say, a 5 year moratorium on or an embargo on voting for him? Or might we have seen some leniency in retrospect on the performance enhancing drug era of baseball? And regardless of how you feel about the severity or not of these wrongdoings, the precedent back then established the notion that the most severe punishment was available and that could be meted out, and I think has set the tone for the game ever since. I
Mhm.
find it not at all objectionable that these men were not allowed to see the field again. I think it's sad for them, and I think it's sad for the game of baseball. But I'm sympathetic to the notion that there are certain violations, certain elements of the game that once broken deprive the person who broke them of the opportunity to participate ever again.
Yeah.
And so while I think Landis was certainly flawed, and there are certainly elements of this investigation that were very likely flawed too, and that different players had different levels of involvement and maybe different degrees of culpability. In the net, when I emerged from having listened to the greatest myth in baseball history episodes, I remember thinking, by and large, these guys got what they deserved. And I think by and large, the game ended up coming out the better for this punishment, even though there may be elements of individuals involved that could be very sympathetic. Um, that's, I feel like in the net, the right outcome happened.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you have your perspective, and I have mine, and we're talking about this and really trying to understand. It's like, what do you think? What do you think of this aspect? Well, um, it sounds like even though it was not enforced, even though players were gambling for years with impunity, they should have known. Like that sounds like what you're saying. It's like they knew right from wrong, right?
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, it
Mm.
gets to, I think, a very human element that exists in all of us, which is that they knew in order to accomplish what they had been told or what they had agreed to do, they had to change what would have been the natural impulse for them on the field, which was to play at their very best and
Yeah.
to win. The goal was to win at the end of every day, at the end of every game, at the end of every season was to win. And that in order to be able to accommodate this deal that they had made, they had to not win. They had to
Yeah.
lose, or they had to not put in the best effort. And I think every single player would know in their hearts that what they were doing was wrong.
Yeah.
And so it's a shame that it wasn't caught earlier and that the people who were responsible for this weren't held to account. But I'm glad in the end that they were. And I like to think that the game that we all enjoy today, for all of its flaws, and it's not perfect, is better for that enforcement.
Well, I think something you said goes to this universal point of they knew in their hearts, but could they actually hear their hearts? And I
Mm.
think that's a problem. It's like we
Mhm.
lose touch with our bodies and our feelings and we can't hear it. We just get like so much gets in the way. It's like Chick Gandil, the first baseman for the White Sox, he definitely could not hear his heart. Like he had walls and walls up. Like he was the villain of the story if there ever was one. But again, he must have been he must have been hurt as a kid. And like he had so much anger. He was the third or fourth highest paid first baseman in the league. So he was making enough money, more than many people. But he was so bitter. He had so much anger toward Eddie Collins for past issues when Eddie would, swipe him from second base and broke his nose as he was stealing. So he had a lot of a lot of revenge to be had. But he
Yeah,
was not in touch. He was not in touch with uh what was right. And that's definitely a product of the time, but I think that's still true today. It's like we can't really listen because there's so much getting in the way.
that's right. And he decided that in some way, it seems to me that the right thing for him to do in the moment was, I'll just call it get even, get
Yeah.
his, and also assert some dominance in the way that certain things were going to go, even if it meant something to the detriment of the team or
Yeah.
ultimately to the game.
Yeah. Nobody else mattered, right? There
That's
was
right.
no community for him.
That's right. He was taking control of it all,
Yeah.
and so too, because of their confederacy were the other players who had decided to follow his lead, and so they were going to decide. And I can see why someone would do that, but it doesn't make it in my mind any less wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
The one character that we haven't talked a lot about, in fact, maybe not at all, you and I in this retrospective, is the role of Charlie Comiskey. And he's emblematic, I think, in the you're telling in the episode of ownership in general at the time. But what makes Charlie Comiskey unique, I think, especially in the re-listening of the episodes, was recognizing that he was quite a gifted player himself back in
Mm,
the 19th century. And so he had the perspective of what these ball players were experiencing, competing and on the field and making a living growing this game. And then he had a separate perspective as the person who was taking on the biggest risk of all, buying up in, basically making the big investment and the big bet to stand up a franchise and a stadium and the staff and the employees to compete.
yeah.
And I thought that your accounting of Comiskey was fair, that you dispelled the myth that he was some miserly Scrooge that was hoarding his pennies, because he did pay his team quite lavishly. But at the same time, he was a participant in the structure of the game that suppressed what these players could also go out and earn in a truly free market.
Yeah.
And I think and I would love to hear you talk about, in retrospect, how you think about Charlie Comiskey and through this very complicated set of facets of his personality and his life.
I like to think of it through the lens of not how he could have been a better person, but it's like he wasn't privy to the psychological, scientific research and studies that we have today that show certain ways he could have acted or behaved uh, from a more benevolent, kinder, humane way would have helped him as a businessman. If he would have, and again, this is a time for accessibility. I think players, fans, coaches, managers, owners, like they talked to each other, they saw each other more, or had that opportunity to do so. And he saw his players as a commodity, even though he was a player, even though he was uh, a big part of trying to separate and create this league. Like when he was a player, he tried to create the players league where the players had control, right? And here he is years later as the owner who has absolute control. And so it's like, if you could have understood like what's better for everyone, then everyone would have benefited for, giving respect, for treating your players with respect, for seeing them as humans and understanding what they needed, or hiring somebody who would see to that. He cared about his fans. He did a lot for his fans, but you might say, well, he paid his players a lot. He did, but that clearly wasn't enough because they're the guys who turned. Like you have all these other teams and you have stories of other teams cheating and throwing games, but it was this team that really did this, participate in this scandal under Comiskey. So it's like you missed out. It's like to see the whole picture. It's better to be kind, to use more of a carrot than a stick, I think.
I wonder if Comiskey, in the later years of his life, looked back on 1919 and asked this very simple question: Why me?
Yeah,
When cheating was, I think, by your telling, fairly rampant, and
yeah.
lots of other owners would have had similar dynamics with their rosters, and at least in the likelihood that they knew what was going on, to at least to some degree. And it was Comiskey that ended up getting busted for it and costing him, as you rightly point out, the possibility of a very durable, very successful run, like a dynasty, really.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Like he was not thinking, oh, what could I have done? How could I have behaved better to uh to salvage the situation? He was like, woe is me, right?
Yeah.
The dynasty, yeah. He lost out on so much. And in retrospect, which is really hard to know at the time, but like there are little things he could have done to avoid all of this, right? He had this huge, bitter rivalry with Ban Johnson, the head of the American League. And that's really what caused this to come out, right? If it wasn't for that, which is also a really interesting part, if it wasn't for their rivalry, their later hatred of each other, and they were once good friends, it probably would have slid on by like many other uh, gambling scandals. But because Johnson hated Comiskey, he made it his mission to expose the cheaters when he found out. And that's what led to the exposure. And so we look at this and think, oh, somebody saw this. And to your point, they saw these baseball players knowing right from wrong, and they did this wrong thing. So somebody saw that and they decided to punish them. That's not what happened. It was self-interest for Johnson to get revenge, to sink the White Sox and Comiskey, and he did. And that's what led to this. So many things that Comiskey could have done along the way, could have mended fences with Johnson, could have treated his players with a little more respect. He could have had the greatest team in baseball history from the 20s to 30s, even with the Yankees. Yeah, so really interesting to think about.
Yeah, exactly. I, I was aware, like I think most baseball fans, of the phenomenon of the 1919 Black Sox, as they're now called, but never really came to appreciate so many of the details, and especially the dynamics of individual players. In the case of Comiskey, the owner, or Van Johnson as the commissioner, and all of this, the commissioner of the American League, and then of course Landis's role. So it's a service to baseball fans that we have this insight in going not only to what happened, like what are just the facts of it, but who were the people involved and what might have motivated them.
It's not pointless to talk about history without paralleling it to current times, but it's certainly much more meaningful if you can see how repeating history can help in what you're doing today. And I think this is one of those things that most people will agree if you ask them. It's like, can you learn from history? Oh, yeah, of course. But we don't actively do so. We don't actively look at what's going on in the past and see how it's repeating now and how this can help us change what's going on, because so much of what's going on has already been done over and over again. And it's happening again. And there are too few people who are aware of the patterns, but it's not like it's impossible to become aware. So I think that's really the beauty in history, to look at it and really understand the cyclical nature of history so that you can learn from it and apply it.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well, just one other thing here is, it's like, I love um, stories and movies with the long con. It's like, I love Ocean's 11. What's that? One of my favorite movies is Christopher Nolan. Uh, what is it called? The Prestige. Uh, and like, there's a long con in that movie that's awesome. I just love this idea of someone being so patient. And I know it's like it's in the service of a con, but it's like for someone to think about that and pull it off. And I really uh, like this idea of Shoeless Joe pulling a long con on everyone because he plays the country rube. He is illiterate. He can't read much, and yet he was very intelligent. He was smart, but he really played that down, and that could have served him well in baseball, because even if after a while people know that he's a good hitter, there's still this part unconsciously in the background. It's like, oh, he's illiterate, he's uh not smart, he doesn't know what he's doing, he's ignorant, he's naive. And that can be playing out in how you react to him, and he could be benefiting for years. But also with this scandal, I think that played into it. Like, he's actually really intelligent, he knew what he was doing, but then he says, "Oh, I was taken advantage of," and he plays that part to gain more sympathy over the course of his life. So I think that's not talked about as much, and I think that's worth further explanation. But it's also really interesting to think about, if he did that and pulling that off.
It's so hard in life to get people to take a second look at what they consider to be settled science, to borrow some phrasing that's become more common in the last 6 years since COVID. And so once people have in their heads that they've already decided, they know Shoeless Joe, and so they have in their heads this a portrait of a man, and along comes a an alternate explanation. It's very difficult, I think, for those stories, those alternate stories that are no less true, but just maybe more recent and require revisiting long held assumptions to take root.
Yeah.
But I think we have to tell them, and I think they have to be told. And again, credit to you for having done this. Uh, One of the consistent themes throughout the Midnight Library of Baseball is that things aren't always as they appear. Even things that are as well known as the 1919 Chicago White Sox, or the Field of Dreams, which has been seen by hundreds of millions of people. There are elements of these things that are, uh, on the one hand, very, very popular and have high degrees of awareness, but on the other hand, have levels of complexity underneath them that are not very well understood. And I think you're right. This exploration of Shoeless Joe as not the person that we assume he was has legs to it. And maybe over time, more people will pick up that story and seek to tell it. Because at its core, there's still this very compelling kernel of this person's biography of this super gifted athlete who breaks bad and then has to go make a life beyond. And it's in the life beyond that we come to see that maybe the person that we thought he was on the field is not at all who he was.
Yeah. And like 2 points to what you're saying. One, because it's so hard to change your first impression, it often requires storytelling to do that, right? To get you in there because you won't just listen or change your mind if someone's saying something. So it takes something intriguing to kind of open the door to that persuasion. But also, this is extremely valuable to be able to do because it's not like we can look at this and like, okay, we're talking about Shoeless Joe and trying to change your mindset on him and what's the value in that, but it's every day. If you're in a relationship with someone and you have a certain impression and you're not willing to pay attention to clues that are coming in, then you're in for years of misery because you're in that state of denial. And so being able to flex those muscles to see the truth, even if it's painful, right, even if it upsets a certain narrative that you had, it's really helpful in living the life you want to lead, I think.
Yeah, you're right.
That's all for part two. Stay tuned for part three of the best of Midnight Library of Baseball. Good night.